All right, I wanted to get that started before I forgot.
I usually have a sticky note on my.
I know, but even that doesn't
work. Press record.
I usually set the timer on my phone to go off. Oh, this is fabulous. We have 83 participants tonight. I am so excited. That's a good sign.
Joanne,
right, we are going to get started. It is 6 o'clock Central Time, 7 o'clock Eastern. We're here today with Nora Chahbazi and Jeannie Herrron, who are going to be our presenters tonight. I want to welcome you to the Diane McGuinness book overview. It's just going to be an overview because there's so much to this book that we want to just give you it like a sampler, like a flight, like when you get a flight of beer. Okay, it's just a sampler about why our children can't read and what we can do about it. Dr. McGuinness was a cognitive developmental psychologist and professor at the University of South Florida. In 1997, when this book was published, 43% of the children fell below grade level. Drawing upon 25 years of cutting-edge research, presents a new phoneme awareness program that overcomes the shortcomings of other systems by focusing on the crucial need to understand and hear sounds of the language before learning to read. The book study came about recently after a small group of individuals, rebels I might add, got together to talk about speech to print, an approach that is rarely talked about as an intervention or instructional method. Dr. McGuinness, the matriarch of speech to print, recently passed away. It is our hope to honor her, that we share some insight into this approach and how you can use this approach to improve reading and spelling for not only those that struggle, but for all students. Today, Nora Chahbazi from Ebley will be our presenter for chapters 1, 2, and 3. Dr. Jeannie Herrron is also a research neuropsychologist. She's the director, Talking Fingers, developer of the NICHD funded educational software, author, Making Speech Visible. She's an editor, a neuropsychologist of left-handedness, is also with us today. So I also want to give a shout out to Nikki Pratty, who has a Facebook group called Speech to Print Exploration. I'd like you to check that out if you have not done so. And also the Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College, are 2 Facebook groups that are supporting these endeavors. So without further ado, we have Nora and Jeannie.
Yeah, Janine, I would like for you, I know that Janine, just a little, I sound like a boy tonight, so I apologize. I've had this bug thing, getting over it. But Diane McGuinness is very near and dear to my heart. This is my favorite book I've ever read on reading. I read it back in 1997 before it was even out in bookstores. And I actually interacted quite a lot in about the first 10 years after I read this and taught my daughter to read and taught teachers and all with Diane. And she was a spitfire and I learned a lot from her. And she really is the reason that I switched from being a nurse to teaching reading. So I always have had great admiration and felt tremendous sadness at her recent passage, but Janine actually got to meet her. So Janine, do you want to talk a little bit about that before we get going?
Oh, okay. Well, I was doing EEG research and evoked potential research at the University of California in San Francisco in a big dyslexia project. And Diane came out to meet us and talk to us because she was interested in what was going on in the brain. And we were interested in what was going on in the brain with kids who were struggling to read. And so we had a number of good conversations. I think we were both on the road to thinking very hard about speech and the contribution of speech to the whole process of learning to read and write. And I wish there could have been more time with her. It was a very good encounter for me, and I hope for her too.
That's awesome. Yeah, she was revolutionary, way ahead of her time with, I think all of the stuff, she was the science of reading well before it was, it was
well before it was cool.
Yeah, for sure. It was not cool, for sure, for a long time there. So we're gonna go ahead and get going. So our first question, I put the questions in too, and I know that Donna had emailed them to you, but I'm just gonna read the question, and then, a few of the quotes that I pulled out that kind of go along with it. And I would like you to, we want this to be very interactive. So after each chapter, we just pulled one from each chapter, and if we have more time, then we would like for you guys to suggest other parts that you'd like to talk about. But if you will either raise your hand, if you can be unmuted and share your thoughts about it, or share in the chat, and then Donna will, we'll share that with us. So either way. So our first question is, what are your reflections on Donnie and his contradicting reading and spelling experiences first and third grade? Now, this question is, I'm a little bit self-centered on this one because Donnie, when I first got this book in the mail, because it wasn't in bookstores yet, and I read that story, it was almost exactly my own child's story, our own experience. So, and including it just was kind of uncanny. So I'm real curious about that too. So what were your reflections about that? He was a great reader. It says here, his first grade teacher said he was the best reader in his class. And in third grade, he had to guess so many of the words when he was reading that he couldn't make sense of the story. And then this particular story, replete with spelling mistakes, it's the submarine story, was up on the wall at parents' night. And he got 100% week after week on a spelling test. So he appeared to be a great speller, but he couldn't spell in his writing. He appeared to be a great reader in first grade, but he couldn't read once he got to third grade. So what are your thoughts, your reflections? What would you like to, raise your hand if you'd like to be unmuted, or share your comments. Excuse me. And we're hoping some of you will raise your hand, and so we can have some verbal discussion too. But comments are good. Have we got anything going on, Donna?
Yep. Sarah says page 6 was remarkable. His excellent auditory skills, superb visual memory, and terrific vocabulary duped the teachers into thinking he was reading.
Yeah. Has anybody had that experience before with your classrooms and your kids?
I have.
I'd like to really hear more about that, or, I think that's really worth discussion because, we say how when we delay to pick up these problems, usually it's about third grade, then these kids, it's much more of a challenge when they're in third grade as opposed to in first. But if they're looking to be a great reader in first grade, but they're really not, how do we manage that or deal with that?
Mm-hmm. So we have some comments. Sharon Dunn says, yeah, he's a good kid. He could memorize and cope, but as the words got more difficult, the wheels fell off the wagon, so to speak, because he couldn't code. I see the discrepancy in my own students with spelling. They can easily memorize 10 words for a short time, but have much greater difficulty using correct spelling in their own original writing. Yep, that's true.
Yeah, we do have, Sandra has her hand raised. So maybe Sandra, can you unmute and you can tell us your thoughts, and then Donna can give us a little bit more.
So I think this piece of this kiddo is exactly what I experienced in the 90s when I was teaching reading recovery. Before I learned about speech to print, that you would have kids that would appear to be a strong reader, and they fall apart when they go to write. And what's important to me in his writing sample is he has like lots of missed vowels. So he has lots of words that don't have any vowels, which I think is very interesting because when I'm working with kids with a speech to print approach, I don't see that. They always have vowels. It's just interesting. It's fascinating.
Yeah. What do you think about he could read in first grade, but not in third grade?
Well, I mean, that's obvious. I mean, they read pattern books. You memorize. I mean, I had kids. I kept a few of my like level readers. I mean, I had kids who could read these level readers. This one's called Danny and Dad Go Shopping. And each place they go to a new, each page they go to a new place. Well, I mean, very easily a kid could read this just by looking at the pattern. But if you get into third grade, it's not really patterns. There's more content. There are more multisyllabic words. When you guess a word at third grade, your guess is usually really wrong because it's usually a multisyllabic word. This little kiddo is explaining the problems that I think typically many teachers who teach with a balanced literacy system encounter in third grade. They look like they're good readers, and then they hit that, what everyone says, they hit that wall in third grade. Now, I would say you'd hit it earlier if you were looking for different things, but that's another.
Very good. Yeah. Jeannie, do you have anything to add to that?
No, this is everybody's experience. And I've seen first grade teachers display a child reading a book that a child has memorized the words in and say, look, she can read. And they're not reading at all. They're just memorizing the visual appearance of the words.
That's right.
Yeah.
Eileen
Very
has her hand raised. Eileen, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I think one of the other thing that's interesting about this, at least where we are, is just how siloed our different grade levels are from one another. And
Mhm.
so the message that this quote happens in third grade somehow oddly communicates that it's the third grade teacher's problem and not the result of, the third and fourth grade teachers are left holding the bag. But it has been so hard to generate any level of introspection amongst the K-2 teaching staff. It's been baffling in our advocacy out here in Washington State about it's just really hard. And I feel like the science of reading has allowed people that buffer to essentially give that mea culpa, when I know better, I do better. Oh my heavens, I didn't know, right? But before they are just doing, so many of them, because it has not entirely caught fire. They're doing what they're trained to do. They're doing, we still are hearing families go into IEP staffing meetings and stuff being, with the suggestion that they read to their children as if they're not, that they have, the idea that they should talk more to their children or, whatever, all of these myths and the like, and the onus so seldom has come back to professional conduct, professional instructional practices and the like. So I think that getting the responsibility for this where it belongs, which is with our early instruction and intervention, as opposed to, foisting it onto the folks who have to carry the ball in third grade. So.
Yeah, that's very, what I had a real eye-opening experience with this adult that I taught, and there was a video about him, and a teacher who was like a second grade teacher maybe, or first grade teacher said, you know what? It never occurred to me that these kids that were with me, and maybe they were struggling some, or maybe not too much, it never occurred to me that they might move on to higher grades and not be able to read, or especially that they would move on to be adults. It just didn't even, you're right as far as the silos and not lack of communication. I feel like that would be helpful, because a lot of times the first grade teacher's like, good, like with my daughter, look, she's the best reader in the class. Yay. Look at, good job. Yay, all of us. And then she moves on, and then she falls off in second grade, and she's not. So I do agree that the communication piece too.
And I would just add one thing, Nora, the biggest ally that we have in our district is a former first grade teacher, now learning assistance program. So level, tier 2 interventionist. And I swear, I'm sure this woman could teach a cantaloupe to read. She's so talented. She's so amazing. She was amongst a team of 5. So in a big elementary school, 800 kids, 900 kids, right? So they were barely keeping their heads amongst them with the 5 of them, let alone looking up, looking back in terms of what was going on. And then she moved into, after 30 years in a first grade classroom, into an intervention role. And she went, oh. And she has been, and because she is a trusted person in the district, in the building, in the district, people respect her a lot. She's able to do and say things that we as parent advocates or other professional advocates haven't been able to. So just that ally, building those allies and stuff amongst folks is really necessary. But getting her out of her silo was what was allowed her eyes to be opened. She didn't know they were shut. She didn't know they were shut.
It's an important piece, that you're like, how do you know what you don't even know? I don't even know what's happening in second grade. I don't even know what's happening in first grade, like you say, in other first grades. That's a good point. I hadn't really thought a ton about, but yeah. very much so. Donna, anything in the comments? that
Yes, there's
you want-
really good
Oh, wait.
comments.
Jennifer has her hand up, like literally her hand up. Or were you waving to us, Jennifer?
I just wanted to know
How do you see that? I don't see that.
I just saw her waving like this kind of.
Yeah.
Oh,
I-
you're
I'm
breaking
still
up,
kind of
Jennifer.
grappling with the idea.
We can't hear you.
I'm sorry. If you can't hear me, I'll just
That's
I'll put
better.
it in the comments.
No, I can hear you now. I don't know what you did. Oh, but now we can't. All right.
Okay, so Joanne Kellogg said, I have a rising third grader now, supposedly reading on grade level, asked to write the alphabet, could not get past G. I coming in before G.
L, it was L.
Oh, L.
He had F,
Sorry.
then he had L and G, and then stopped. I mean, the poor little guy, he also has a speech, he sees a speech teacher, but when I gave him that code knowledge test, he had one of the 30, he would only have one sound. And today I worked with him for the very first time, and I literally brought him back to, in reading reflex, the basic code, the very first fat cat. Woo, he had trouble. He couldn't segment and blend. And, you know, God knows, and I guess he just said he's had words memorized. And so we're starting at scratch with him.
Mhm, mhm. Okay.
Anything in the comments before we? Looks like there's a good bit of comment.
I'm just looking at chat. No, I think we're good.
Very good. All right. Jeanine, anything you want to add before we move on to the next chapter?
No, let's move on.
All right. So our next for chapter 2. Here's our question. Before reading this chapter, what were your thoughts about the causes of reading failure? And did they shift after reading this chapter? And reflect on why they did or why they didn't shift. I think that's an interesting thing to think about for sure. And so here's some of the quotes. Readers don't understand why someone can't learn to read. I think that's very interesting because those of us, for me, reading was very easy. It never even occurred to me to think about why somebody can't learn to read before I had a child who couldn't. And then the next one is writing systems are codes for spoken language. Someone has to teach the code because most people can't figure it out alone. The complexity of our alphabet code is a major cause of reading failure. I think from this book, the first time, the second, the fourth time I read it was just like, you know, our code is crazy for sure. The truth is that good readers are relatively rare. So those are the quotes. And so what were your thoughts about the causes of reading failure, and did they shift, and why or why not? So who would like to share about that?
Not seeing anything. No one's hands are raised.
I'll say something.
Okay, Joanne.
I think right now I've worked in a school where the teachers, administration, and it's a private school. And I was alone and started to bring other people on with the science of reading. And those teachers, unfortunately, just aren't being trained. They don't know. And that speech to print now is so important, but they just, until you can get the teachers and the administration on board, it's going to be really hard to improve the reading.
What do you think that they think the causes of reading failure are?
They don't see it as speech to print, that I can't decide what it is because they are inundated with the units of reading, the Lucy Calkins, and I keep telling them they're not, and our 4th and 5th grade teachers, even our 3rd grade teachers would come back and say, what the hell are you doing? These kids can't read, they can't do it. Well, they've never been given the code. They don't understand what the code is. They still want, when I remember the room going with the sound, with the sound chart wall that you used, was that believe too. And I go into a kindergarten word and he still had on the word wall. And I said, what are you doing? I said, these kids don't have this. And nobody was listening to me. And when they needed my help, they started to back, I wasn't getting calls to, do something, except the parents started to call me once I retired for teaching, for tutoring. They still think the 3 cueing system works in the school that I'm in. And little by little, I was making a dent, but I don't know how to get it across to the powers to be that these children, can't do it. Because I had let me tell you this one experience, why I went so heavy into the science of reading. One of the I got a 2nd grader who could not, he couldn't even spell his last name. He could not spell, he did not know the alphabet. And the teacher before said to me, he'll be a 25-year-old who can't read. And that was it. So I proved them wrong. And I got him where he, I only could get him up to the end of 1st grade. By the time I didn't have EBLI then, I didn't know about reading reflex. But I knew it had to be the sound. And with another little one, I took out the name of the letters completely. And I only made him deal with the sound. And then people began to say, well, what are you doing? And that's when they started to take pictures of my bulletin board where the sound was up. That was it. But they still think, people think read to them, so I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot. Sarah, you had your hand up. Hi, Charlie.
Hi, you're in my ear, so she can't hear you. But say hello to Miss Nora and everyone. Hi, Nora.
Hi, honey.
I had a question actually for Janine, which is going to play devil's advocate here. I want to play the opposite side of the field. I want to know cognitively and neurologically why you can teach children to read, rather than, because we clearly just don't know why teachers are not. They're either not being taught or they're just choosing not to. They don't have the resources. But I would love to hear Janine talk a little bit about neurologically, developmentally, why reading is possible for everyone.
Okay, I'll be glad to. What we've learned in the last 10, 20 years, because imaging has been so amazing that we can look into the brain and see what's happening when children are reading or when they're failing to read. To make a long story short, what has been learned is that in order to do reading in a skilled way, there have to be neural links between speech and the meaning of words and the new thing of letters and printed words. So those links, those neural links have to be made. If children are learning to visibly recognize a word just by the shape or the image of that word, they're not going to, their speech is not participating in the process. And in fact, there's been some imaging studies done where children who struggle or children who are dyslexic are using right hemisphere processing rather than left hemisphere processing. The right hemisphere is very good at recognizing shapes and recognizing faces and pattern recognition and so on. So if that pathway is set up in the beginning as something that becomes habitual, that they go to the right hemisphere to see the shape of the letter, that may be a reason why they're developing inefficient pathways. But at the same time, if they're not learning to be able to segment a word into its different speech sounds, not its sounds that are perceived, but the saying of the sounds, they're not engaging the speech processing center enough to make those links between the pronunciation, the meaning, and the print. And that's what has to happen for skilled reading. And in fact, children who stick with decoding and don't get to a point where they're reading words automatically are not making those links, as Linnea Airy says, between pronunciation, meaning, and print. That pronunciation of the sounds and that processing has to happen first before those links can be made. So that's why we talk about speech to print. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That was a
Oh,
great
well
question.
done.
Anything in the chat that you see, Donna, that to share?
Let's see here. This is from Marissa. David, in my district, the higher ups have seen the data, research, etc., and refused to make the change. We've shifted to be a more grassroots movement, teachers showing other teachers the benefits of what we're doing and supporting other teachers to change their practices. It goes back to what we were talking earlier.
Well, the net is in to answer to, I see David's question here. It's a great question, actually. I've wondered this for 25 years. I struggle with how to get changes moving. Should it be sold to teachers little by little or forced by administrators to change common practices? What do you think of that, Donna?
I think it has to happen both. I think it has to happen top down and bottom up. We can't do it one way or the other. It has to come from both sides. I've been really thinking about putting together some sort of campaign, if you will, to get the schools of education for them to hear from you folks. You know, if we've got 160,000 people writing to their universities and saying, you know what, I needed to learn this in college. Can you change your programming? This is what you need to do. If we all started doing that and put some pressure on the schools of education, they'll start producing teachers that know what to do when they get out of college. Okay, but that doesn't help us now. So
Yeah.
Here we are, you know, 3 years into this, at least in my page, you know, trying to get people to change their thinking. And yes, we've been successful. And it's a campaign. It's a, you know, it's a movement. So all, you know, Reading League, all those organizations, it's a movement. So we're doing it bottom up with teachers, and top down, we're trying to teach administrators. I mean, we are really working on getting administrators to understand, right, Sharon? To understand what's going on. Sharon was an administrator. Because you have to have excellent leadership in order to change things in a district. They just can't happen from the bottom up.
Can I echo that, Donna? I mean, that's the work that I do. I think my colleague Chris Martin is here too. We work in a pretty good sized district in lower Southwest Michigan, and I can get teachers moving, I can get coaches moving, but at the end of the day, sustainability lies at a systems level, because the principal's going to leave, the teachers are going to leave. There has to be an onboarding process, which that comes through principals. We can teach and teach and teach. And I've seen it. I mean, it's in some ways wrecked me. I mean, today I feel exhausted by it. Many of us that are in this, because I do the work, we see the change. I see a school change, and the shift this time of year is horrifying. Administrators move, and I just know, and we could have years of work just fall apart. And it's often made me consider, oh, do I need to go into administration?
Yeah.
That takes me too far from instruction. So it's like a stool. A stool cannot live, it cannot sit on two legs. We need teachers. We need quality instruction driven by administration, led by a goal with high quality instructional materials and resources, and a non-negotiable for TPT. Can I get a hallelujah?
Yeah. Can I chime in on that?
Yes,
absolutely.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with what Rebecca just said. It's a dance, and administrators really have to lead the dance, because they're the critical component to lead the way. Side by side learning with the teachers has to be the right professional development. To Donna's point, yes, we need our teachers, our colleges to prepare our teachers. They're not there yet, but in the meantime, we're going to have a big lag time. We've got lots of teachers without the understanding of the science of reading. It's up to our administrators, school principals, and district admin to lead the way, to equip themselves with the science of reading, to move the staff and districts forward, create those systems. Systems is the way we made our changes at my school. We were high poverty school. We went from 21% proficient to 60% proficient for the end of the year state test. I mean, that's a rigorous test. Not discounting what they did on Acadian's assessment. It's amazing. None of the teachers were on board at the beginning, none of them. I had to lead the way, and through the data and the analysis, the professional development, the right curriculum, the right intervention, we had to equip ourselves, and little by little, you lead the way as an administrator. It has to be done. It can't be done just solely on the teachers' backs. It's unsustainable. The administration has to be on board 100% and leading the way, shoulder to shoulder, organic conversations. And that's the way to make the changes. It can be done.
I think too that you can, Jen said Jen Newman had a good point here. Like, a lot of times teachers think it's the problem with the child is why they're not learning to read, because the child has a problem, not because the instruction is a problem. That's a mindset, I think, that's pretty fairly universal, really, as far as what, and I also see, because I work in districts across the country and even around the world but everybody, it happens differently. You can have one teacher that comes in, and I've had this happen many, many times, and the change is so, somebody had just said this, so profound that other people start to pay attention and to listen. So I've seen it happen in a lot of different ways, as far as that, but getting back to the book here. Yeah, there's, we could go on a long time about what needs to change, but where do we think that it's how we're teaching the children that's the reason that they're not learning to read? Or do we think it's because the children have something wrong with them or their parents or whatever? I think that's a really important thing. Jen just says here, can we pop back to what Diane says in chapter 1 about how all current reading methods, including phonics, will fail at least 30% of the children because they obscure the nature of the code. This isn't well understood, especially by teachers who teach phonics. That's a very good point too. And, what do we think of those kids who are not? I think it's really important to think about, even not systemically, and although there's a lot of huge reasons, but in that situation of like us here and right now, why do we think these kids aren't learning to read? I hear a lot of times they're not, I also have a reading center, they're not capable, they'll never be good readers. They're, just some of the things that some of you guys have said too. And do we believe that's true? Because if we believe that's true, we're going to ensure that it's true. And I think it's an important thing, to ponder for sure. But I'm going to go to chapter 3, and then we can.
Can I get on my soapbox for a minute?
Yes, please, Erin.
Okay, so I'm a speech pathologist, and my theory is we are not teaching the code completely. Okay, we're teaching it more one direction. We've really focused on phonemic awareness, but we're really not focusing on the grapheme at all. So the code that we're explicitly teaching during sound symbol association is a manuscript type font, when in reality, what they're going to encounter most often in the environment or when in authentic text is more of a Times New Roman. So look at the word behind you. I can read that that's joy, Nora, but if you didn't know, you would think that that's toy. So we really need to teach the children that they need to understand the concept of letter invariance and know that it's not always about the sound. The grapheme plays a much more important part. I had a child who I suspected was having a difficulty with this. So I gave them 2 versions of the Acadians, which at the time it was Dibble's Next. So for Dibble's Next, they had a report school type font. And then I gave them the old Dibbles. And the child, when the font was changed, read 3 times more words with the report school, which was the font that they'd been taught in, I would say their native font. When they looked at the dibbles, when it was a Times New Roman, the word was LUT, and they couldn't sound it out at all. So I just said, name the letters for me. And they said INJ. And the word was LUT. So if you think about it, they said I because there was lines on it. And you have to have this written down. Like, it's very hard to explain unless you see what it looks like in Times New Roman. So if it's an L in Times New Roman, there's serifs on it. So there's one line that goes to the left and there's a line at the bottom. So for them, that letter L was an I. The N, well, they inverted it. So they made the U an N, and the T had a curve at the bottom. So for them, it was probably the T they were taught was just a straight cross, not used to that curve. So with them, they had not learned to generalize and look at different types of handwritten typography. And the only thing that they had was probably the alphabet line at the top.
That's an interesting point. Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean, it's,
we have a hand raised here. Pam,
Yeah.
do you want to,
Pam
thank you for
King?
sharing, Erin. Yeah, Pam King.
Thank you. I've had some things to say. I started teaching in 1974. I personally had phonics and learned some, but more into the whole language type. But when I went to my school, they did phonics, which is better than whole language. But I know it's not exactly what we're talking about now. I had a teacher come teach next to me and she said, how do you start them? She and I had the same professor. And I said, I use sounds, letters. Oh, I can't do that. I said, well, I'm not sure how to help you. And so in about a week and a half, she was knocking on my door saying, I want a phonics lesson after school. So that was back then. So I've been retired now since 14 and haven't done much, but I have gotten onto this speech to print type thing. And I was very excited about it. And I started to teach one young lady that I only get to see twice a week. And it's just wonderful what has happened. The conference between the mom and I on a Zoom call with the teacher, she said, what are you doing to help her with her schoolwork? I said, I'm not doing anything to help her with her schoolwork. I am taking her from where she is in knowing how to read and working forward as much as we can to get her up to where you are. And that is my goal. And the teacher did not know what to say. And after doing this for 8 months, she has been very successful with that boost that I'm able to give her. But the remediation program doesn't take her from where she is to where she needs to go. And when I left in 2014, so much was you had to, for your remediation, you had to buy a prescribed program and go buy that to teach the children in trying to advance them to where they needed to be. And it took all of the, I don't know, I could call it creativity or the freedom to do what those children need or even that child needs, because it was all prescribed. And that is another failure, I believe, having to go by exactly what is required of either by your state or by your school system or even by your school. Because when I left, coaches, instructional coaches, remediation teachers and all were required to follow those things. And the printed material was not following this science of reading at all.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen a whole lot in that amount of time, for sure. For sure. All right, we're going to pop on to chapter 3. Janine has a lot to share on this. And we also have another thing that we wanted to look at in chapter 3. What is the difference between talking and the words on the page? This is something that I think that kids really have no idea a lot of times that this is even connected. How does the difference impact reading and spelling acquisition? So the difference between us talking and the words on the page that we're reading. So transcribing talk, I wrote that down just because I thought it was a great chapter title. Is reading and writing natural or not? This is a big question with a lot of people that is worth discussing, I think. Writing is coded transcript of talk. This was on page 34 and 5. The average number, now this I think is very interesting. The average number of words in daily conversations, or for high schoolers that they should have in their reading vocabulary actually, is about 50,000. Okay, that's how many words that we have. But when people are asked to memorize what word goes with an abstract visual symbol, like a word, to memorize a whole word, the upper number is about 1,500 to 2,000. So that leaves like 48,000 that they have to guess. And I've seen in the chat a lot about guessing, right? So that's not enough for any language, not even close. So when we're asking them to memorize those whole words, and then for me, I think that's where our fall apart is. These kids can memorize well enough in kindergarten, beginning of first grade, and then they max out and it falls off. And that's where why the majority of struggling readers are at a third grade level I think anyway. So what are your thoughts about that? What are the differences? And this is Jeanine too, with her talking fingers and starting with speech. This is her forte. So what do you guys have to share? Jeanine, do you want to say something about that before we see if we have any questions or comments or people wanting to jump in?
Well, I think the interesting thing about speech to print is that a child has to say the word. Child has to think about what they're doing to pronounce that word and segment it. And then they have to link letters to it in order to spell it. That's a very different process than looking at letters and remembering that a certain letter says a sound and then trying to blend those sounds together and come up with some sound that sounds like a word that maybe you know already. It's a totally different process. So when Diane talks about transcribing talking, she's really talking about the importance of teaching children to pay attention to the pronunciation of the sounds when they say a word. I think most teachers think that phonemes are sounds to be perceived by the ears and by the auditory cortex. What we have to link to letters is the pronunciation of those sounds. And that's really what's missing when we just teach decoding. And because if we just teach decoding, they're not getting necessarily to the point where they can segment a word. And that's the key. That's the key to all of it. I'll stop there and wait for comments.
Okay, Grace, you have your hand up. Oh, can you unmute, Grace? Oh, yeah.
My question is to Jeannie. So many teachers on the chat boards are talking about children having trouble blending the words. Do you think because they learn to spell them by saying the word first, segmenting it, writing it or seeing it, and then saying it again, that would alleviate a lot of the blending?
I do. That was very well said. I think that's exactly what can happen.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Stacy?
I totally agree with you on that. I think my question is, how do you account for different dialects? Like I have a strong Southern accent. So when you look at the word get, G-E-T, a lot of our kids are saying get, G-I-T. So how do you work with that?
Okay. I would recommend to look at the work of Julie Washington, who's done a lot with dialect. And really the suggestion is that there are ways to pronounce things in order to read that are different from the way you may pronounce them at home. So when we're learning to read, we may have to learn a different pronunciation. I've just been working with classes in Jackson, Mississippi, And one of the letters that are embedded in a picture is the letter P, and the picture is a pear. But the teachers say payer. And so the teachers themselves have to start being aware of what they're doing with their mouths to say the word and whether they're following what the letters stand for, because what happens in print is different from the way you may pronounce it at home. And then
Yeah, we like to add syllables in the South.
yeah, we can't be pussyfooting around about the fact that the children will have to pronounce it get in order to be able to spell it.
Well, I think that there's another thing, Janine, too, and this is, like with a dialect, like our New Zealand and Australia people on here, they, their pronunciation is different. But when you're going from speech first, like get, okay, we tell the kids, go ahead and get it. We say pretty, right? The E is another way to spell it. So we'll say to the kids, this is going to be your I spelling. And when you're going from their speech first, dialects, accents, all of those things, and you're in the context of a word and not teaching in isolation, are not become non-issues, because how many kids spell pretty, P-R-I, who knows what T-E or whatever. But when we teach them to go from that sound, well, yeah, you know what, that can be, but this is another way you can spell if. And then they transfer that, which is very interesting. So then it doesn't matter if we have D-O-N who came to for my Canadians, a gentleman's name was D-O-N, came to my training. And I said his name wrong. And he said, his name is Dawn. I'm like, Dawn's a girl's name here in the US of A. But no, they don't have the sound ah where he's from at all. Well, so we're not going to teach you. I taught a 62-year-old Canadian who I'd have to think, because there was a few sounds that they don't even have them, so you can adjust to that when you go in speech to print, because you have that luxury of flexibility, because we're going from their speech and this is the symbol that goes with it. So it's very forgiving that way, I find. Same with it. There's a question in the chat about what about speech deficits and kids who have articulation issues, especially. When they're separating each sound and putting them back together, not doing them just in isolation, you'll see it's a side effect is an improvement in their articulation issues, which is also interesting and fun. So there's different ways. It's not, English is not, and even our code, it's not a black and white and pretty and clean kind of thing, but it is logical if you know what the system of logic is. That's the beauty of it, and you understand those concepts, which Diane talks about, she'll get into later on in the book, which makes it a non-issue, the get thing, because we say get in Michigan too, for sure. We're big on that. So what else? Who else have we got? Eileen has her hand up. Thanks, Stacy.
Can I just clarify that further? So if we use the word get with a short E and get with a short I as an example, am I understanding correctly that what this would propose is basically just kind of sophisticating it up and having that conversation with kids and saying, hey, look, you didn't, like, kind of with a linguistics bent to it, that look, I hear that you're doing that in other, the way that I speak, I would say you say when we spell it, we use the letter E. So we just need to know that your pronunciation is different than my pronunciation. When we go to write, we do this. If that's true, then my question, I guess, looking at as the relative audaciousness that Donna presents about this approach is how is this then different than, for example, what Dr. Moats presents in speech to print, or what folks in OG would present for that same discussion, right?
Yeah,
because I think that one of the things that concerns me is hearing the idea that, oh no, we're about to have a reading wars amongst ourselves. I'm like, stop, banish that thought. Like, what is the conversation? What is the science? How does the science lead us? Right. And so I guess just getting all of that out on the table would be good.
I think that's a great point. And to go along with the book with Diane, and what she's talking about here is going from, when we're going from speech where we're leading with speech. So we're going to say, I'm going to get a whatever, you know, and I do say get, and what we'll do, quite frankly, when I'm teaching a whole class is we vote on, you know, potato, whatever, you know, we vote on how we're going to enunciate it, you know, because we're all going to be doing it together. So we'll do the lines, g, it, all right, and then show them the word. What's your first sound? G. What's your next sound? It. Now look at this spelling. This is another way. We've already shown them that pretty much all consonants and vowels can be spelled in a lot of different ways. They don't, even the little tiny ones don't have a, okay, cool. They don't, you know, like it's one of the things that we do pretty quickly because it's in a lot of stories. And this is another way to spell and it's not just in that word, but it's in the other one. So not to answer that whole, you know, sub reading wars or whatever. I think that, you know, it's new learning, and that is why we're having the, you know, this kind of overview thing of how is this different and what is the difference. And it's that it's not speech to print is spelling, it's the approach of going first from the sounds that we're talking about, and then always adding the letters to them. I think a lot of times we stop like with phonemic awareness, and some don't do letters at all, but we always add the letters because that's where we use phonemic awareness. That's where we're going to need it, is with the code and all of that. So when you're going from sound first, and then you immediately add the spellings, and the kids understand these concepts that she talks about with the one-to-one mapping and one to, you know, many and many to one, that then it's a non-issue. I don't know if I'm answering your question right or well, or whatever. Eileen, you feel free to clarify if you'd like.
I guess what I don't know if there's anybody on the call who can speak to essentially how folks who are deeply OG trained would counter this or would oppose this, or does this align with their training?
Okay, who on here has done both OG and speech to print? Is there somebody, could you unmute if you have? Or let's see, who do we have here? Do we have a hand? Nikki would be, I don't know if she's on here tonight. Is she on here, Donna? I know she would be good. Sarah, have you done OG? No.
Nikki's waving.
Sandra.
I have, I don't, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Is Nikki on here?
No.
Oh, hi, Sandra.
Who'd you say, Rebecca?
There's a Nikki Calamanis is trying to get in.
Okay,
it's not Nikki
so let's let
Prodi.
her.
I was just going to say, I'm OG trained, and the way they taught us was that you say the short E sound, even with the student with an accent or a speech deficit.
Okay. I think the question was the difference between the OG. Svetlana, can you speak to that? Thank you for raising your hand, my dear. Yes, I guess you can.
Yes, hi. So yeah, I was OG trained first about 5 years ago. I only did one, week-long session, but enough to know the premise of it. But the difference I would say is, and I don't know how, I guess you don't really know the difference until you experience both, because I was EBLI trained as well. And now I can never go back the OG way, but OG was very much, here are the, a lot of those drills, right? You have the cards and you show the card of whatever, EA or OA, and you do a bunch of drills, right? You show the card, they say just that sound for that phonogram. And then you're gonna do the blending and the segmenting with non-words and parts of syllables and whatnot. But you're never really taking it from, okay, here's the word motorcycle. Let's do the syllables we hear in motorcycle. And what sounds do we hear? Motorcycle. Oh, okay, there's 4 syllables. Let's try those syllable lines. Motorcycle. So you're taking it from the pronunciation and then putting letters on those sound lines. It's a very opposite approach, again, but what Nora's saying, but I don't think anyone really gets it. We can keep saying it over and over again, but until you, I think, do it, that's when you go, oh my gosh, it's so subtle. It's a subtle difference, but it's really, truly reversed. You are going from that pronunciation, like what Jeannie was saying. You have the child say the word, they pronounce it, and then now we're gonna take that pronunciation and we're gonna map letters to that pronunciation. Whereas OG, You're taking letters and you're making sounds to those letters. Letters make sounds in OG, whereas speech to print, your mouth makes sounds. You're the one making the sounds, and now we're going to put some letters to those sounds. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's the big difference.
Okay, well said. Can I jump in here?
Please.
I think the jury's out on this, and what Nora is saying is that if they want to spell it GIT, and you say, oh no, it's GET, but you can still say get, you're explaining to them that that letter E can sometimes say and sometimes say I. And I think with early literacy instruction, that children are using implicit learning, they're using what's being called statistical learning to look for patterns and repeated patterns over and over again. And as soon as we interrupt that pattern with a word like said or was, or we're interrupting that process of pattern recognition. So I think, and I could be wrong, Nora, but I think that the letter E should stand for the sound E, and that they should say get and spell it GET. And that it might be confusing to them to say, oh, sometimes E says I too. At that point, I mean, they're going to learn that,
What point are we talking, Janine?
We're talking about when they're first introduced to letters and sounds and segmenting and encoding.
So like the beginning of kindergarten, you mean?
Kindergarten, first grade, yeah.
Yeah, we give our kids, not until about 3 months in, maybe, in a whole class situation, where we start introducing, there's several different ways to spell and a few for what, that type of thing. So once they do that, before that, if they say, the at when we're reading, and then they say get, we're kind of okay that. But when we, like with pretty, we kind of have to, because we never say pretty, right? But that's further along. So it's like that very basic code, which we don't stay in forever, right? That's a beginning basic stuff that you get the blending, segmenting, and all that as a taking off point for what they need to do. But yeah, I would say by the middle of kindergarten or a little bit before, they can really understand that concept when you teach it to them, because they're getting explicitly taught. And so they know that there's different ways to spell k, or different ways to spell E, or different ways to spell whatever sounds that we've looked at. And so then they understand with that self-teaching, that this applies to other things. And that's why we don't have to teach them all of those things. But it's not like, oh my gosh, how is that possible? That in this is, we're saying and in get, we're saying here. It's not jarring to them at all, because it's been explicitly taught to them, if that makes sense. That's been my experience for 25 years anyway. And the teachers that we train, I think would agree with that. But I understand that when you haven't taught that way, like Svetlana says, you can't explain this. That's people who at Jen Newman, I would like, Jen Newman, why don't you jump on here? She's going to be doing a chapter 2. Jen did OG for a very long time. Could you speak to that, Jen? The get thing, are you here?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I was busy typing a question.
You've got some good ones over there. I'm trying to look, but that difference between when, like our kids, how they can manage that forget, and we're saying get, that E can be if, and how quickly they move to that because of the process and the differences. It's just hard to explain. And I know, like you had said too, and Aaron Sain had said, it's hard to explain this until you do it and see it unfolding, kind of thing. So you're a good explainer though. So I'm wanting to see if you'll.
I don't know. I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add. I was just noticing, I think, what somebody typed in the chat about talking about how we all have different ways of pronouncing words, and that there's, sort of one way we're going to learn to do it in school. And sometimes I also just talk to kids about how, when we're talking about isolating the sounds, that's sort of not natural. When we're talking, the sounds all flow together, and they get changed by what's coming next and what came before. And I think probably early on, I wouldn't, if it's a really young kid, I wouldn't overemphasize it because of what Janine said, just confusing them at that point, and you can return to it later on when they're ready for more sophisticated analysis.
Not like the beginning. We do CVC words and CC. This is not something we do in the beginning reading instruction.
Right.
It's the progression type of thing. Yeah.
Ask about that, Nora. So one of the things that is that, and I'm wondering if Janine can speak into that, because she did talk about the statistical learning, and I'm wondering at some point, and thinking about set for variability, that's one of the pieces where with this, I wonder, too soon, are we explicitly teaching some pieces that if we stay with the speech to print route, set for variability and statistical learning will make its way for the majority of the kids, and we're attending
very quickly
those that don't. But I'm just wondering, that's what I think we might be talking about here, that we don't want to do that too soon, because set for variability, what we've got to give them more exposure to the speech to print, the pathways, how this works, and then set for variability and statistical learning will take on some of it, and we're really closely watching, informatively assessing for the kids that need us to be very explicit that CE can say can say sometimes, or represent it.
Okay.
Janine, am I way off?
No, it's okay. It's okay.
All right, Sandra.
I've been dying to jump in. I think because I've done both OG and speech to print, and I will say that there is a certain percent of the population, and one being my son, who we spent years, literally years in OG, him learning A, apple, ah. It's that piece of speech to print that talks about that sounds have different spelling, that one sound can have different spelling, and that spellings can have different sounds, that once that piece of, oh, you told me A, apple, ah, the first time he saw it a different way, his immediate reaction, and I've seen this time and time again with kiddos just like him, is, oh, I'm stupid because you told me it was that way and now it's done. And he can't get past that fact, also past the fact that we spent years working on short vowels. That when you spend that long stuck on a short vowel, it's really hard to move on because you've spent so much time saying A says ah. And some kids can't get past that once you've done that to them. And then when I moved to speech to print, it took one day. We did something like what Nora does at the beginning, where a lot of her lessons, she does the beginning, like that sounds have different spellings. And he was like, oh my gosh, why didn't anyone tell me this? Like, I can do this. It's that. And now, when other people said he would never be able to learn to read, he's picking it up on his own because he has that framework, like, oh, this isn't that hard. There are like 4 things I need to know: that sounds can have different spellings, spellings can have different sounds, and sounds can have 1, 2, 3, or 4. That's doable. Not like there's like a whole stack of cards that he has to go through and memorize.
And that's what's really hard to, I mean, I've been teaching this way, training thousands of teachers and probably taught tens of thousands of kids with all the coaching in schools too, plus my center. But so it's hard to, I've been doing exactly what's in this book, kind of beyond it now, but as the foundation, this is what and we start actually in preschool. I go in with a morning message and we pair it, and I say the, they say the. So they've got exposure to this idea. Look at here, that all 4 of those letters spell A. Say those sounds, A, and they do it, and they're like, cool. And the preschoolers even can learn it perfectly fine and very kind of easily. And even the struggling one, there aren't any red kids anymore in kindergarten because they, do some need more repetitions? Yeah, but not a lot. And the teachers that have been teaching it too, it's the same. They're like, one teacher said to me, and he was a special ed teacher, he's like, he had a different job before it, and he just recently said this, and he said, I just thought, can it really be this simple? Can it really be this easy? I've heard it was supposed to be really tough, and some of these kids just won't learn to read, and here they are, like, he didn't have any undoing to do or any previous mindset, but I think that we need to have the mindset that if our kids can talk, they can learn to read. And you know, the faster we get there, the better, because that's what we all want to do, right? And that's why it can. If they can talk, they've got the sounds. They're there. They've been using them
True.
for however
right.
long they're talking. Yeah.
We have 4 people with raised hands. We
Okay.
have, we're over time, but let's see, can we get through this real quick? Judith, you're first.
Okay, I just have a question about dialect users and TH. The TH that's voiced or unvoiced can be sounded as a V or an F or a D or a T, and I've had trouble getting through to somebody about that. And I wondered if you had any tricks. Thank you.
I would have them spell a lot of words with TH in it, with the sound being voiced or unvoiced, so that they see a way that it's used most frequently, and they are pronouncing that word with a TH sound, either voiced or unvoiced.
Okay. Eileen?
Well, I just want to sort of reiterate what a couple other people have said. I don't have the baggage of having been taught how to teach reading. I have only the experience of about, I don't know, a year or two with a 5th grade English language learner who was taught with reading recovery badly with many systems. And then we found Nora. And if you teach, and she's doing great, and if you teach a child that words are made up of sounds, that you can isolate the sound, and that sound can be written in many ways, you never have E is eh. It's never an issue, because E is a sound and you can spell E a bunch of ways. And it is just like, oh, okay. And
great way to
it's
put
very
it.
frustrating. I feel like I felt very often as a student, undergrad or grad, whatever, where the professor takes the first half of the semester to refute the theories I have never learned so that they can go on to the theories that they're trying to promote. And that's where the first 3 chapters of this book were, I think. That they're ingrained, they're instilled. I'm sure there are political and economic interests that obviate against whatever you want to call this, speech to print or science-based, whatever. We call it Nora. We have made Nora a verb. We're going to Nora that word. So what are the entrenched interests? What examples do we have of successful educational change systemically? A lot of different things. But if a child knows, at least, my experience is really limited. I also speak 2 languages, and this child's a second language learner. But if a child knows that this is a sound, and there are these 5 ways that you can write this sound down, or if you see these 5 things, it might be this sound. Might not, but it might be this one. It's really a non-issue for the child. I mean, they have a little guessing to do, but they just tell them. I mean, it's really
not really guessing. So if there's 5 ways, like we're giving them 5 different ways, it sounds that go with the letter A, they may read my name Nora, and then use that phoneme substitution to push in the right?
Yeah.
So it's not guessing like just from everything. You have these.
Oh, no. But it's guessing among the 5.
Yes.
For example.
It's using the different.
And another issue I haven't heard brought up, I didn't get all the notes on the sequence of the neurological pathways being built. But one of them is there is a word and it is made up of sounds and there's meaning in there somewhere. So the assumption is that if a child can say a word, they know what it means. And this is not true among second language learners in my experience. They can say words, they don't know the meaning, and then that whole pathway gets lost. But that's a different kind of process, I think, than we're talking about here.
You're absolutely right, that the meaning has to be there with the word that they say. And if they don't know it, you need to define it for them.
Tell them.
In a sentence.
They need to learn that it's okay to ask because they've been punished for asking. But yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Jennifer, you're the last hand raised.
Okay, so I just thought with reading the book that
It kind of goes into the next chapter too, which I know is our next session, but like, I really felt like the whole long discussion about the way these languages, you know, the ones that were, you know, Chinese and Sumerian, at first, I mean, it was sort of a tough, it's like a textbook. So for me, it was a challenging read because there's so much to it. You know, a little impatient with what, all right, let's get to it here. But I really felt like what was different about this than really anything else that I've read, and you know, I'm kind of from the side door also. I'm not a teacher of reading. I'm an occupational therapist with a child who struggled with reading, and then working in a school system for years where I see so many kids struggling and just want to do what I can to help. I just never saw anything about that history of the language, and then really, really focusing on what does that mean? Like, if that's how we're speaking and communicating, and our language and many languages in the world are different than these symbolic type languages of Sumerian and Chinese, where they use the pictographs and those types of things, I think that's what's missing. Like, I've just never heard of that. And I have some OG training. I have like a 30-hour background in that. And then I've taken the Reading Simplified, which is the, you know, some speech to print, and I'm taking letters now. But like, I mean, in letters, there's a little bit of that at the beginning, but I just found that to be very remarkable. And I think that she spends a lot of time in the book on this. So I guess I just wanted to bring it back to that. I'm not exactly sure what my point is, but I just felt like, I know she gets more into it in the next few chapters also. And I think it becomes more clear as we read the book, but I feel like, you know, the challenge, you know, we were talking earlier in the session about what's the barrier here, I guess. And I think it's the lack of knowledge of this. I mean, I just think it all goes back to lack of knowledge. And then I'm sure there's political things too, but I think even though, like at a regular school, I work at a number of different schools, and I think most of the teachers are well-meaning and well-intentioned, but they just don't really know, or they're constrained by their curriculum. But I did find the discussion on the language piece and starting with that to be extremely interesting. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I've got a question, Nora. The speech to print book by Louisa Moats, is that what we're talking about here? Or is that book? Right,
No.
right, right.
Not.
And
No.
I'm wondering if, you know, if people are confused about that.
I would imagine they would be confused because it's real confusing. So I think it would be almost impossible not to be confused. So many people have said, well, we teach spelling. That's speech to print. That's what this is. But really what we're talking about here, what Diane is talking about here and what she tries to get through, I think she does a pretty good job of it, is that we're talking about the approach of how you deliver instruction. It's not about anything but that, quite frankly. It's not about spelling or reading, you know, this is decoding and this is encoding. We're teaching decoding with what she talks about. So her, you know, prototype really, I guess, is integrated teaching reading and spelling at the same time in the same activities. Not like spell in the same lesson, but in the same activity, we're teaching reading and spelling so that the kids understand the reversibility of the code and that it's used for both. And we're going to apply it. You know, we're going to be reading and getting to, you know, that piece very quickly, but it's the delivery of the instruction that has to be done by a teacher. It's not something that I just answered something on a Facebook thing about this. You don't buy a workbook and give it to the kids or even walk the kids through it. There's no words there at first. One of the most critical pieces is going by what you hear. Especially if you're getting into second, third grade, but even little kids too, have that letter name interference. They see the letter and they just want to say the letter name, or they do a lot of things with that. We're removing that and focusing on what the kids are actually have coming out of their mouth, what their ears are hearing their mouth say, and being able to segment those sounds. And, you know, we teach that phonemic awareness in the context of these activities too. So, and that's what she's talking about, how you can do that so efficiently when you're going from what we say, which is natural, and not from these man-made letters. And we didn't get to our list that Janine, I do want to point it out. Janine had talked about on page 53 about these questions that teachers were about, like, is reading natural? Many, if not most people, think reading is just as natural as walking and talking. And that couldn't be further from the truth, right? So we don't go from these arbitrary letters that could have been symbols of like shapes, triangles and squares and, or flowers or whatever. We don't go from that, which man made, to try to, put down what these sounds are that we're saying onto paper. The Cherokee language, look at the history of Sequoia. Phenomenal, fantastic, interesting story about how he called the white man's books talking leaves. And they made up their own language, like a Z was t or whatever. He and his daughter figured out how, to put sounds to the symbols, and they taught the entire Cherokee nation. It was a simple code, unlike ours, to read in just a couple of weeks, like over hundreds of miles. It was pretty impressive. So it's just this code. We say the sounds, the letters, or whatever we have chosen, we have letters, are symbols that represent them. It's that simple. And then we have to match the symbols to the sound and understand that there's 20 ways to spell sh. You don't have to know them all. You just need to understand that SH is not our only way to spell sh. And you will know that very quickly when you're doing a word like special or nation or passion or whatever. Kids are going to get exposed to that and realize that, and it's no big deal because they're like, yeah, I'm saying these sounds, there's symbols, there's a bunch of different ways to spell different sounds. Oh, same, CH can be ch, right. Oh, but it's also k, like in school, or sh, like in chef. And it's not a problem to them because we don't teach it as, here's all these arbitrary symbols you have to memorize and know all some arbitrary information. You speak the sound, there's the symbols to represent them. So it's not about, and Louisa Moats definitely talks about, obviously, the theory of the speech to print, but if you're doing anything that's focusing on those letters, like where we need to use rules, or we need to use syllable types, or we need to use exceptions, or I don't know, long and short, or magic and silent, all those things that are about the letters, not about what we're doing here, then that's not speech to print. So it's an approach. And that's what's really confusing for really almost universally for people to understand. And we've been talking to people about it for years, 25 to be exact, 23 actually. And as far as to teach people, so we try to show but even that, it's just like people will take a little piece here and there, and this piece or that piece. This book explains it really, really well. Why did I saw questions in the thing. Why hasn't she been around? Why didn't anybody know about this? I've been asking that question also ever since I read it in 1997. Great question. I don't know why. Janine, do you know why?
I do.
Who knows why? Okay, why?
She had a clinic in Florida and the like, but she kind of left it in the late 90s, early 2000s.
It was her daughter's.
She kind of stepped away and then ultimately sold it, and they just kind of stepped away from it. And so
that's not Diane's story though. Diane did a lot of work in England, and her son Jeff and Carmen, I went to that center in Florida, actually. I was trained by them. They left and somebody else is running it now, but she never did that. They were her students and she helped with the research and stuff, but they started the center and the clinic and had students there and all that type of thing. But she still did work like until not very long ago, a lot in England. She came back to Florida, I know, but still, why didn't anybody look at her research that they did? I mean, that research that they did back in 1996 that was published in the Ordinance Annals of Dyslexia, talking about, I think, 87 students that they did research on. And I had somebody from Ed Week that was talking to me about a story that they were writing, and she's been a journalist forever. She said, Diane McGuinness, if I did a search on her books, I told her, read this book, doesn't come up. No place ever in Ed Week have we ever mentioned it. Nobody was, I mean, she would say to me when we would have discussions, how are you in schools? I have been working so hard to get into schools all these years, and I am like held back from, I don't know how you got in schools. I'm like, I don't either. I think it's ignorance is bliss or something. I'm not sure how I got in schools. It wasn't even really by trying, but she tried a lot. And then she worked with the Rose Report and all of that in England. But why has it not been something that people have even looked at this book or know about this book?
Yeah, I just think that she kind of moved back to England, and then the Center of Florida and that kind of work just kind of, it was sold, and in the early 2000s, it just went very quiet. The person who bought it didn't amp it up, didn't promote it. And there were other, between Balanced Literacy and then OG, I mean, there were two machines out there that were pushing narratives, and there was nobody really pushing this narrative. But it's just my conclusion after looking at this for about 5-6 years.
Yeah. I mean, I think that she got sick of trying, to be perfectly honest, from my conversations with her, but because she's just like, and I don't know why, and why nobody, even the book has not been, it's one I've always recommended, but people are, yeah, that's not a popular book. So I don't know. It's a curious, it's a great question. And maybe it just wasn't time yet. Maybe it's time now, who knows? I hope I answered your question, Donna. Oops, you're muted.
I'm gonna have to jump off.
Yes, thank you. Okay. We have one more comment by Jennifer Newman, and then I think we're gonna call it quits here.
Thanks, Janine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Janine. See you next week.
I'm learning. Okay, bye-bye.
Go ahead, Donna. What's the comment? All right.
I think
she has her hand raised.
Yeah, Jennifer Newman's next.
Okay.
Yeah, no, go ahead and read my comment. That's fine. I think you touched upon it. It was really just the question about Louisa Moats and the speech to print book, and how that is confusing for people, because she does, in the beginning part of her book, advocate for this type of approach, but then kind of goes off in a different direction that's really more print to speech. And I was curious if Janine had any awareness of, whether she had contact with Diane McGuinness, or if they ever spoke, or.
She said she did in the 70s. Oops, in the 70s, but not after she was doing this work that I'm aware of. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I don't remember seeing her name in the book either. Later on, she talks about a lot of different researchers, but I don't think Louisa Moats was one of them. That I recall.
All right. I think this was excellent. I think we did it was very good, very stimulating conversation. You might hear from other people. We only had room for 100 people, so I am upping the account for next week. So everyone will be able to get in case you hear anything. What else? Yeah, next week is Marnie Ginsburg, chapters 4 and 5. And I don't know if she'll do the same format, but I think I really liked how this worked out, Nora. It's very good.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Donna, can I just ask one more question? Is there are multiple editions of the book? If folks haven't read or haven't purchased their book yet, is there a particular edition or cover that you're looking at? Because when I searched on Amazon, there were it listed multiple editions.
This one.
That's what I thought. Okay. But okay. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay.
All right.
All right, everyone.
I thought it was weird to see so many different covers.
Very good. Thank you for being here. Good night.
Bye.
Hmm.